All right. So let's go ahead and get started here. So, hello, my name is Danielle Langlois. As you can hear, I am in fact not from around here. I actually live in the Czech Republic, but um, we are from Muni or Masaryk University in the Czech Republic, and that is where I've been living for the past few years. Of course, you already know my supervisor, who is taking photos of me right now. Right. So when I entered the PhD program at Masaryk University in 2022, there was one kind of open-ended topic area, and that was esports training. Well, that can take on a lot of different areas, right? So I had come from the area of psychology specifically. I had done some other research related to video games as well as robotics. And so I was curious, like, okay, how is this going to shake out, right? So what are we going to do with all of this? And what I ultimately decided was we needed to enter in with one kind of general assumption. And that was that esports professionals and those who are soon going to be professionals or are trying to actively be professionals deserve good quality training paradigms that will get them to the highest levels and then keep them there. And so that's where we started, right? And this was back in 2022. And so as we go through, of course, as a researcher, one of the very first things you're going to do is you are going to look at past research. You're going to look and see what other people have already found. And of course, there's a lot of different points I could cover in this, but just to kind of keep it a little bit more, I guess, narrowed down to the actual topic area at hand. So we have team cognition is going to be really important in the context of having a good like team environment. So team cognition is like you can think of it as being on the same page with the rest of your teammates. And so things like being prepared, having good communication skills, and a generally positive atmosphere really impacts this idea of team cognition. Then we have mental health areas that are related to esports or like esports skill or doing well in an esports context. So we have things like avoiding rumination, specifically around like loss or losing. So rumination is when you spend all your time like focusing and going in circles on the same thought over and over and over again. You're ruminating on it. And so if you're constantly thinking about how, oh man, I can't believe I lost, like that's not great. So obviously avoiding that is a good idea. Then you have things like game and life separation. We need people to be able to kind of unplug and be further away from the games at certain points. Then, of course, using good quality coping mechanisms. There are a lot of coping mechanisms out there. They are not all good. So things like I don't know, eating a nice meal with a friend, good coping mechanism for dealing with stress potentially. Exercise also a good coping mechanism. Less good coping mechanism might be something like I don't know, binge drinking. And then the last thing would be like a growth oriented mindset. So things like I can get better, I can do better, this is not the end kind of a thing. And then finally, one of the most important areas, there was a fairly recent study that found that they kind of created a model of health in the context of esports. It's actually a really interesting paper. But one of the things that I noticed as somebody with a psychology background is that a lot of the areas that they were covering are very similar to the biopsychosocial model of health. And this is essentially an old school model of health from like the 1970s that posits that a person's health is not just related to their physical health, there is also a social and a psychological component. So, by looking at all the stuff that I've chosen to tell you about today, you can probably guess where we're going next. And that was we started out with a kind of some basic exploratory surveys looking to see what was actually happening in the esports world. And so the first one was done through social media. We recruited people. And then the second was through a program called Game Tester. And our results aligned pretty well with some of the stuff that we'd found in the past. And that paper is currently in the middle of the publication process, and that actually marries quite nicely with the talk we were just listening to about some of the difficulties that they were dealing with in Poland, because these difficulties are not unique. We actually found a lot of the same ideas coming up over and over again, like lack of access, not having a lot of support, coaching being really important, but a lot of people not necessarily having access to that coaching, right? So these are things that came up multiple times. However, of course, for me as a psychology person, I started to see a trend that we found where people had this understanding that their mental health was not really being supported. So we found that there was a perception of a lack of teamwork being focused on communication skills, as well as like things like stress coping. So now you know where we're going. So we had a topic area. So we've narrowed down from just esports training to, okay, let's focus on these soft skills specifically. So then we went with a more specified plan. So we decided to do a series of mini games that would be as part of the training paradigm that an esports player would, or an esports team would be using. And so we came up with 3 different mini games, and we have been in the process of designing and then user testing these mini games. There are 3 of them. We're going to cover each one. The first one is called Bellows Buddies. The second one is called Mindful Moves, and the last one is called Capricious Coatis. Um, and yes, the alliterative names were my idea. I am insufferable. I'm sorry. So what you can see on the, I believe it's for you guys, it's the right side of the screen. You can see an image or a graphic. Essentially, this explains the design process. We started out with just some general ideation. That's number one. Then we moved on to actually creating the 1.0 version of each game. Then we did some user testing, just kind of see how people interacted with the game. Did it work? Did it function? Did it function the way we hoped it would? What are some things that we should add? Then we went back to the drawing board, or to Unity in most cases, and made some of the changes that we thought would actually make the game better. And then we are currently in the process of doing more user testing for the 2.0 versions of these games. So that's kind of a rough overview of how all of this has gone on. So keep in mind, as we're talking about each one of these mini games, that there are 2 versions of each of these mini games, and in fact, some of them have more than that. So let's talk about Bellows Buddies first, because that was the first one, or this one. This is the one that's done. So we'll start with this one. So Bellows Buddies is a team-oriented breathing game. So the idea is that 2 players play together, and they are engaging in a breathing game where they are breathing simultaneously. So the player in general is playing as a dragon, and you are trying to keep a forge hot so that a blacksmith can forge a sword or a shield or something like that. That's the general idea of the game. So you can see that I have a bunch of screenshots here. I forgot when I was making the PDF that the images would squish. So you don't get to see all of the images separate, but that's okay because I can talk a lot and explain to you roughly what the differences are between the 2 versions of the game. My fault. So with the 1.0 version of the game, it was a lot simpler. We really only had a 1-player version and a 2-player version of the game. The instructions were a little bit more rough. And you can see on the final screenshot here of the actual game itself, they're roughly around the same-ish time during gameplay. That's where the screenshots come from. But the player is exhaling into a microphone, like via just a normal headset, and that sound that the microphone is picking up leads to the dragon to trigger the flame, right? So it's a fairly simple system. The 2.0 version of the game is a little bit different. The timings are a little bit different. There is also a timer in the bottom right. Me and right and left is impossible, but the bottom right-hand corner, just so players know roughly how much time is left is in the game. There is also a tutorial level in the Bellows Buddies 2.0 version because we found that people are very competitive. And so when I just said, hey, play this game, people would struggle maybe with the controls at first because it's not something that people are used to, using your breath to actually control the game. And so they would kind of struggle a little bit, and then they would get frustrated because they thought they were losing. So we added the tutorial in as an option so that people could kind of experiment with how to make the controls work. Those were some of the primary differences. We actually had really good feedback on our lovely Unity asset that we used, as well as the general like system and how it worked. It worked a lot better than we actually thought it was going to. So we're actually very pleased with that. So overall, then we, of course, we're doing all of our user testing and stuff. And most of that user testing, actually, I shouldn't say most, all of the user testing is done. I am so tired. I don't want to look at it anymore. You know how most researchers know that you get to a certain point with certain things. So the game in general worked as a breathing exercise. People generally liked it as a breathing exercise. The thing that was a little bit more challenging was the teamwork component of this. So the way this game was set up is that you and somebody else had a headset on and you were sitting next to each other playing this game. You couldn't see each other. And you were wearing a headset, so you couldn't necessarily hear exactly what was going on. So we think that that was kind of what led to the problems of us not really having this like teamwork component that's really clear and obvious to the players. What was interesting was that a lot of our data collection was actually done at a gaming conference. So we ended up, or specifically a game developers conference. So we ended up hearing a lot of good ideas from various people who were involved in the game development process. And a lot of them had really good ideas. Things like having the players face each other instead of having them sitting next to each other. Alternatively, we could use just the microphone instead of, the full headset so that people could hear each other a little bit better. Another idea that I thought was a really good idea was instead of having the players breathe simultaneously, they would breathe like on off patterns. So, like, while one of the players was breathing in, the other one would be breathing out. Does that make sense? So, those were kind of some of the interesting things that we found. In general, again, like people generally liked it as a breathing exercise, so that was exciting. One of the things that's really interesting about this particular mini game is that there have been prior instances of games being created that are controlled through breathing, but a lot of them have used very like finicky technology, and they specifically noted, hey, the technology we used is very difficult. We just used regular gaming headsets and we managed to get pretty good results. It worked fairly consistently. So that's actually kind of interesting from at least my perspective, is that we didn't need a lot of the extra fancy stuff. So let's move on to number 2. This is called Mindful Moves. And this is, once again, kind of a breathing based mini game, but this one has a physical movement component. So the participants are breathing in and out, and they are doing stretches simultaneously. So it'll be things like holding your arms out like this or putting your arms above your head. And we also, for the 2.0 version, decided that it would be interesting to also explore input methods. So the original 1.0 version of the game was controlled via just the keyboard. So you can imagine how awkward it might have been to have your arms up like this, and then you have to reach down to press the keyboard to get it to do the next thing. So for the 2.0 version, we switched it to be basically whatever input you wanted. And so we had a few different options. We had a mini keyboard, and that was just the mini keyboard. And then we had a ball that we thought that the participants could squeeze. And that created kind of like a stress ball scenario. And then you can see the little whale that's in my hand there. And you can also squeeze the stuffing out of the little whale. And that would also function as a controller. Basically, all of them were just the mini keyboard stuffed inside of other items. So it was basically the same controller each time. So what we found in the differences between the two different versions, and actually this is one of the games that had like 3 different versions. The initial version was made in Godot. Then we ended up switching to Unity, and then there was another version that was made for a thing called the Exercube. It was a whole long process. But the original version of the game, you can see some kind of screenshots here, where participants are they're kind of seeing like a park kind of environment, and you can see on the 1.0 version, there is a little stick figure in the corner, and you are supposed to be mimicking the stick figure. Now, what we did for the 2.0 version, and 1.4 and whatever onward, was we changed up a little bit about like how we did the inputs, as well as like instructions, of course, and we also added something that I think actually we have not completely analyzed this data yet, but I think we added something that hurt us more than helped us. So in the 2.0 version, there's not just one stick figure, there's actually 2 of them. You can't see in the images that are out right here. But there are 2 stick figures. One is the current pose and the other one is the next pose. And people had a hard time grasping which one of the poses they were supposed to do. The idea of having the next pose was just to prepare people for what they would be doing next. But a lot of people kind of, again, struggled with that idea. So I think that was something that we added in that made it extra complicated and probably a little bit too complicated. We also, because people like to have scores, they like to improve and things like that. So we added a score sheet or a score that gives you information about how well you performed at the end of your little gaming session. Okay. All that makes sense, I hope. So we actually did our most recent round of data collection at Ars Electronica, which was about a month ago. And so we ended up collecting data from around 64 participants, and the actual data analysis is the next step. So I'm looking forward to seeing what it's actually going to look like and what our findings are actually going to be when we are done. And of course, in the image there, you can see me actively playing the game. You cannot see, I think I have the whale in my hand, but it's the other hand that's further away from the camera. So it's unfortunate you don't get to see me squeezing a tiny whale. So then the final game, and the game that we're actually still doing data collection on, hint, hint, please God help us. So this one is called Capricious Coatis, and yes, a coati is a real animal. They're in like Mexico and that region. of the world. This is a visual novel that was created in the system Ren'Py. That's kind of an open access system for the creation of visual novels. And so the general idea is that it focuses on communication and teamwork. So the conceit of the visual novel is that the player character is entering an esports team. And so they have to deal with, what do you do when your teammates start fighting? How do you cope with social media? Things like that. And so the idea is not necessarily to select all of the right answers. The idea is more so to explore what different responses, what are the pros and cons of different responses. So it's things like, you did a good job or you advocated for yourself in this way. However, this other team member might be mad at you for, not defending them or whatever. Okay. And so, like I said, data collection is still ongoing. So here's some images from the game itself. You can actually see some of the early development. So on the top two images, that is basically the exact same thing. It's just one has the actual graphics put into it and one does not. Underneath them, there's also images of some of the code that we were putting in, as well as Twine, which was an early system we used to kind of organize how the decision tree was going to flow. And then you can see on the bottom two images, there are some screenshots from the actual like game itself, from the players. So, or from the different characters that you interact with. So there were some really interesting things that I found over the course of doing 1.0 to 2.0. And that was that because this is very narratively focused, there was a lot of stuff in the writing that I had to like really think about my own biases and things like that. So obviously, I come from the US, and that's, a different culture than here, or, the broader Central European area. And so there were some things that I didn't really think about that popped up a couple of times. So, for example, I have played games before where, you had character sprites or character images, and the characters would not really express much, or they would just have an image, and that wasn't a problem whatsoever. So when I initially drew the characters, I didn't add like extra emotions onto their faces. I just gave them fairly neutral faces and then stuck them into the game, right? But I found out very quickly that the people who did user testing for us really did not like that. They wanted their characters to emote. And so for the 2.0 version, I had to go back in and try and create more expressions. And so you can see in some of these images, like the first one is fairly neutral. And then the other one, there's some people like scowling and stuff like that. And so it gives you a little bit more information, I guess, to go with how people are feeling. And again, that's something that I didn't think people would care about, but they really, really did. And then, of course, there's other like little writing things, like, I wrote things that amused me and then nobody else got the joke. So, of course, I had to kind of recalibrate some of those things. Um, yes. Okay. And so that is basically the end of my talk. Like I said, we are still doing data collection for the visual novel. I have if the QR codes on this presentation are not working, I'm not sure. They're kind of formatted weirdly on here. I have another QR code on my little tablet here, and you can also just play it on the tablet if you would like, or just look at it on the tablet, even if you don't want to actually participate in the full study. So I appreciate your time, and that's about all I have. So questions?